and religious conversation. And a large part of my rabbinate in the past, over the past 4 years, has been engaging the community and working with strategies about how we can talk in ways that are productive and avoid talking in ways that are destructive or that scare and frighten people. And so that's my agenda for this evening. But as I said, we don't stand on ceremony here. If you have something that you concern, something that needs clarified, or an objection, just put it out there. I'm going to start with a lament. My lament is that there are books that I feel like I should have written, because if I had written them, and I'm capable of writing them because they're very bad books. But if I had written these bad books, my bank account would just be spectacular instead of kind of average at the moment. And the one on the left is a book that I read as a little kid, The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey. And it was about how the 70s were going to be a period of great tribulation. There was going to be the four horsemen. There was going to be the beast. And after the tribulation, there was going to be the rapture. And the creation was going to be renewed with Jesus of Nazareth coming back to planet Earth. And things would be just fantastic then. This book sold 40 million copies. This book sold 40 million copies. And so even with a very small royalty, you multiply a small royalty by 40 million and the estate's looking pretty good right there. So that's, and so this is the book, one book that I feel like I should have written. I wish I had written it and I didn't. The other one is from about 25 years later. In 1995, we had the series of books called the Left Behind series, which really begin with this question of the rapture and the Antichrist. And again, they are terribly written books. They're just awful. But again, they sold in the tens of millions of copies. There was a whole series in this. There was a series of about 10 books. The whole series sold close to 50 million copies, and that's a good payday. That's a good payday. I bring this up, though, not just to lament my poor planning, but because this is how I experienced the apocalypse first, the first context that I had of it. And I think the first context many of us have from this is the fundamentalist Christian setting. I mean, I wasn't in the fundamentalist Christian setting, but I was reading along with them, and because they were really taken up by this figuratively. And so this is, but obviously there's a history, there's a larger context to the apocalyptic, there's a history that we'll go into a little bit. And it doesn't have to be Christian or even religious in the sense that we think of religion to be an apocalypse. So the context is quite a bit larger. What is an apocalypse? Apocalypse is simply a Greek word for revelation, that you are exhibiting something that's concealed, which is what revelation is. You're revealing something. We use the word revelation. We usually use the word revelation in its prophetic sense. And revelation in its prophetic sense is a public event. And it's never more public than it is in the story of Revelation for the Jewish people. We were all there at Sinai when it happened, all 600,000 of us, according to the Torah. The law was given to us, and we had to decide whether to follow the law or not. There was nothing secret. And there was no need for mediation. The whole point of it is that everyone has access to it, and therefore everyone can just decide to follow the law or not. The apocalypse is not public. The apocalypse is not open. The apocalyptic is a form of communication. It's a genre of literature that requires mediation. Not everybody has access to it. Not everybody gets it. And even people who get the main message need some sort of instruction of how to understand the signs correctly. So apocalypse is a closed revelation. It's a mediated revelation. And it's this mediation that might be the real I mean, that might be the real litmus when you look at these different narrative genres to see whether it's apocalyptic or not. There are some other differences between the apocalyptic and prophecy. The prophecy is about history. When you read a prophecy about, behold, a virgin or a young woman shall conceive, it's talking about the politics and the interest of the kingdom of Israel at that time, at least the way it's presented in the Hebrew Bible as we have it. It's not talking about the cosmos. It's not talking about something that's going to happen in the distant past or in the distant future. It's about the politics of the day, because prophecy is about history. The apocalyptic escapes history. The apocalyptic usually is about the cosmological, but it could also be about the internal. It can be something that no one can see, that's not available to the historical lens. So that's the second characteristic of the apocalypse, that it goes outside of history into other realms, either the personal or to the vast cosmological. And where prophecy is focused on the duality of good and evil, either you follow the rules or you don't follow the rules. You're good if you follow the rules. You're bad if you don't follow the rules. The apocalyptic is focused on another duality, and that's the elect versus the damned, the saved versus the lost. And usually this duality has not to do with things that people do. It has not to do with their behavior, but it has to do with knowledge that they have, with gnosis, that you have a special knowledge that puts you into the elect, or you don't have that knowledge, which makes you lost and damned. I mean, and obviously, just from this little sketch here, we see that the apocalyptic is very influential in Christianity, because a lot of this language is on the surface of Christianity. Christians talk about saved versus damned. There's special knowledge that you have to have in order to be saved or damned. That's the knowledge of the true meaning of the career of Jesus of Nazareth. And Christianity goes outside of history. It internalizes a lot of the what's going to happen. The destiny is internalized to a large degree, and there's obviously elements of mediation that make Christianity possible. So Christianity is heavily influenced by the apocalyptic. Judaism in a more limited way, but clearly as well. But I think that anyway, we used to. Some scholars said the apocalyptic is the mother of Christianity. And that sounded so cool, so we kept saying it ourselves, I think. So when you look at literature to see whether you call it an apocalypse or not, it's important to note that an apocalypse does not have to be a calamity. And likewise, a calamity doesn't have to be an apocalypse. In the Torah itself, we have two really detailed descriptions of calamities, and these are the two extended portions of curses that we read in the synagogue. And if you are lucky enough to be in the synagogue when we're reading the curses, you know what's going on, because the Torah reading is longer than it usually is, and the reader is reading it in an undertone. I'm reading it very softly so that I can hear and the gabbis can hear and people can hear that I'm reading, but I don't use it in my full voice. And so we read in the curses, the Lord will scatter you among all the peoples from one end of the earth to the other, and there you shall serve other gods, Eitzva Evan, wood and stone, whom neither you nor your ancestors have experienced. Yet even among those nations you shall find no peace, nor shall your foot find a place to rest. The Lord will give you there an anguished heart and eyes that pine, and a despondent spirit. The life we face there will be precarious. We shall be in terror, night and day, with no assurance of survival. In the morning we'll say, if only it was evening. And the evening will say, if only it were morning. Because of what your heart shall dread and your eyes shall see. The Lord will send you back to Egypt in boats by a route which I told you you shall not see again. And this is the end of it. It's very depressing. And when we get there, we're going to offer ourselves for sale as slaves to our enemies. But we're going to be so pathetic, no one's going to buy us. This is a terrible calamity, but this isn't an apocalypse, because this is open prophecy. And this is something that everybody in the community knows about. It's describing something that's going to happen in history. And it is the purpose of this is so that we make better choices as a community, and we don't put ourselves in the position of having to sell ourselves as slaves to people that don't want to purchase us. But so even though this is very negative, this is not an apocalypse, because there's no mediation. It's historical, it's open, it's prophetic. So to show you something that is an apocalypse from the Hebrew Bible, and this is probably the most famous apocalyptic book of all, maybe the second most famous, the book of Daniel. And at that time shall Michael, the angel, stand up, the great prince who stands for the children of your people. And there shall be such a time of trouble, such as never there was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time your people will be delivered. Every one of them shall be found written in the book. And many of those that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting contempt. But those who are wise shall shine as the brightness of the heavens. And they that turn to the many through righteousness as the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even to the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. Now we see in here all of the characteristics that I spoke of as from an apocalypse before, that this is a closed revelation. Daniel is told to shut the words up, to not put them out there. They require mediation. The duality is not between the good and the evil. The duality is between the wise, the knowledgeable, and those who don't have access to the tradition. And the setting here is clearly not history, because you have angels and stuff. You have people becoming stars and shining in the heavens forever. So this is a closed revelation that requires mediation, is cosmological. So we look at this and say, aha, we have an apocalypse. This is an apocalypse here. An apocalypse, as I said, a calamity is not an apocalypse, and an apocalypse does not have to be a calamity, even though we use those words interchangeably in English. And to point this out, I bring to your attention something that the American community is not always onto. And this goes to the fact, whenever you hear about the large amount of evangelical support for the state of Israel, a lot of people will say, well, they're just interested in the apocalypse. I mean, they're supporting Israel because this is one of the signs that is Jesus is going to come back, and so their support of Israel is not wholehearted. And I don't know if their support of Israel is wholehearted or not. But in Israel, we have the same sort of views that Christian evangelicals spread in the United States, but they're spread by Jews. In 2008, Chuck Hagee, who's this major evangelical figure in San Antonio, he made a speech, and he was affiliated with the John McCain campaign. And he said that the Holocaust was just kind of the painful preparation for what was going to be realized as this glorious redemption that would be the state of Israel. And the American Jewish community flipped out. The ADL called him anti-Semitic. John McCain was forced to disassociate himself from him. But the thing is, and what people don't realize if you don't know how Judaism is practiced in Israel, there's a large community of religious Zionists. And by the way, these are the people that they're worried about coming into the government at this point, who, under the teaching of Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Kook, following the 1967 war, became apocalyptists. They felt that the signs of the birth of the state of Israel, its military triumphs in its various wars, and other signs meant that we were going out of history. And therefore that the secular state of Israel was an enemy in a way of the true Zionism. And this, of course, caused very, very serious conflicts with them and the authorities, which persist to this day. But they didn't feel like they were going into a calamity. The apocalypse was something that was going to be wonderful. It was going to be Geulah. It was going to be redemption. It was going to be the full messianic promise of the state of Israel realized. And so not an apocalypse there. So that is just sort of the definitional part of what I wanted to talk about before I go on to where the apocalypse comes from. How does the apocalypse shows up? I just thought this would be a good place to stop. I've spoken for exactly 20 minutes. And we'll do any questions that you have, any comments, things that you didn't get that I said that need to be explained, things that you got and you think are poorly considered, or things that I said that you found to be brilliant. We could do all sorts of feedback here.
Rabbi, humanity has always been on the verge of total disaster, and somehow we always muddle through.
Pontificating.
Is that where the apocalypse comes from that experience? It's since the beginning of humans?
I think everything comes from that. I mean, that experience informs both the apocalyptic literature. It also informs the prophetic literature, which recognizes that human societies are prone to fall apart and wants to give people the tools to not have society fall apart. It informs the wisdom literature, books like Job and Kohelet that say that there is human suffering that we can't explain, or maybe we can explain. How do we deal with it? How does that fit into our religious life? So yes, the apocalyptic, I think, does come psychologically from the recognition that we are sort of teetering on the abyss individually, if not society, if not as a society. But I think that it informs every aspect of biblical life. The priestly voice is certainly informed by that. How do we have a relationship with a transcendent God when we are non-transcendent creatures that are liable for corruption and decay? So yes, and little asterisks. Am I the only one here who read The Late Great Planet Earth? No one else is stepping forward to admit that they read The Late Great Planet Earth.
I read the first of the Left Behind books, but I did not read Hal Lindsey.
Well, so do you agree with my estimate of the literary quality of that book?
I mean, again, given that I read the Left Behind, not the Lindsey books, I would say Left Behind was masochistic, and I wasn't masochistic enough to read more than 3 of them. So, and they're like 15 of them. They're pretty wretched.
Tell me the truth, Joshua. Do you think I could write that book?
So I'm going to actually suggest no, and that there's something that you and I are not seeing in them, because there's a lot of other similar literature that was not nearly as successful, which suggests that there's something we're not seeing that they managed to find in particular that you and I are not noticing beyond just the writing quality.
You're dampening my alarm, Josh. So it's going to go home and make some money. Okay. Any other thoughts about my little test for determining whether sprinkle on this to see whether it's an apocalypse or not? Oh, Melissa, she has her hand up.
Well, I was just curious that the association of apocalypse was not catastrophic, right? Because all of the sort of common parlance when you hear apocalyptic and apocalypse is a very strong association with catastrophic. And so is that just the Christian co-opting and that's a default? Or so that was that uncoupling from calamitous was really interesting for me.
When you think about, so part of it is I don't know if it's that it was a Christian co-opting. I mean, so much as that our model for it are the books of the Hebrew Bible. And in the Hebrew Bible, the apocalypse is usually not a happy day. And Christianity went from there. But we use the same model of thought of the apocalypse. Let's say that some rich people in Bel Air decide that a spaceship is going to fly close to the Earth. And if they do certain procedures, if they say certain prayers, if they wear certain costumes, they're going to be taken up in the spaceship and live forever. I mean, so you have the elements there that are it's a mediated revelation. It's not public. It's only given to a few select people who have the job to decipher it and to spread it. And they don't necessarily want everyone to participate. I mean, they want to be the ones that are saved. You have the fact that they're stepping out of like science and history. We don't have the experience of spaceships in our history or in our science to know that they are there. So they're moving away from that. But the ending that they're going to, it's a happy ending for them if it works. I mean, they're going to live forever on the spaceship and see the galaxy. And so that's the model. That's sort of the model that we're doing, and it applies both to the books of the Hebrew Bible that are calamitous, but it also applies to social situations that we would not describe as calamitous. I should tell you, though, that the point that you made about Christianity co-opting it was exactly the point that Yehuda Svi's Cook's father, Harav Kook, made in his writings of the apocalypse. And he says directly that the reason everybody thinks that the apocalypse is a calamity is because it's through the Christian usage. So there's probably something to that as well.
Would you say that the Jewish idea of the Messianic age is an apocalypse? And is that the source of the happy ending in Christianity?
It can be an apocalypse if it's a Messianic age in Judaism where history ends, which is, I think, a common theme. And by the way, next week we want Mashiach later. We're going to talk about Messianism and all of these things. But if there's a supernatural, if the Messiah is coming to bring a supernatural ending that's pleasant, that's an apocalypse according to sort of this schema. But there's also Messianic ideas in Judaism which are completely contained in history. That the Messiah is simply coming to affect something positive in the realm of regular history and do things, and that is and if it's like that, then it's not an apocalypse. I mean, what matters is the way in which the narrative is spread, is there mediation, and is it contained in history or not. So I will end with that. I'm going to talk probably for another 10 minutes about where the apocalypse comes from, and then I'll just throw my own thoughts on. And so in another 15, 20 minutes, we can have our larger discussion of things. Let me go back to the I still haven't figured out how to get this to go back to where I was. So where I lost it. This is worse than the apocalypse.
You should write a book about it.
I I was primed to until Josh pointed out that life is not as simple as I'd like it to be. So where does the apocalypse come from? And particularly when I ask this question, I'm asking, where does the biblical apocalypse set? What are the social groups that wrote all of these crazy texts? The first answer that was given, and the answer that dominated scholarship really well into the last century, was that the apocalypse comes from outside of biblical society, that the apocalyptic literature is a contamination of sorts. It's a non-Israelian source of literature. And so the idea was that, well, the wisdom literature, well, we know the wisdom literature isn't indigenous to the biblical literature, but we know that it has some nativeness there. The prophetic is considered to be the heart and soul of the Israeli contribution through the Hebrew Bible. The priestly literature is obviously, again, not necessarily indigenous, but strongly set within, we can set it very well within Judean society. The idea was that the apocalypse is not like that. The apocalypse was something that either in our exile to Babylon and being under Persian occupation there, or when the Persians just occupied everything in the world, that they had these crazy otherworldly views. And it was under their nefarious influence that the apocalypse was put into the Hebrew scripture. And that is, and so there's no point in studying it. And plus we'd have to learn Persian, and we all know how painful that could be. Not for Persians apparently, but for non-Persians, it's a difficult language to get some facility in. So basically, it wasn't. We didn't try to figure out the social setting of the apocalypse because we believed that it came from someplace else, someplace out of the biblical society that we were trying to reconstruct. So we wouldn't try to do what we would try to do for the other forms of biblical literature. When biblical scholars began to look at the apocalypse as something native to the Bible rather than as something wholly imported, the first move that they did to understand it was what's called a deprivation theory. In other words, the apocalyptic literature is written by the losers of society, people for whom prophecy had failed and had no recourse but to move the framework that they didn't like, which was in this world, to something else that would be more friendly to them. And so we have this very nice Haftarah that we sing on Rosh Chodesh. It's beautiful. It's from the 66th chapter of Isaiah. Thus says the Lord, the heaven is my throne, the earth is my footstool. Where could you build a house for me? What place could serve as my abode? All of this was made with my hand, and thus it all came into being, declares the Lord. Yet to such a one I do look, to the poor and brokenhearted, to the one who trembles at my word. That's where we get the idea of the Quakers or the Haredim, people who shake when they hear the word of God. And this is seemingly written from the point of view of the poor and the brokenhearted, from the people who tremble at God's word, who believe that God is going to turn to them away from the ones who think that God's throne isn't in heaven, but it's in the temple, who think that we need to build a house for the Lord. So in other words, this is imagined to emerge from a circle of people that were deprived of access to the temple, perhaps because they were Leviim and they were being suppressed by the Kohanim. And so prophecy failed for them. And so this beautiful Haftarah closes, for as the new heaven and the new earth, which I make shall endure by my will, declares the Lord, shall your seed and your name endure. And new moon after new moon, Shabbat after Shabbat, all flesh shall come to worship me, said the Lord. And then the last verse of Isaiah, they shall go out and graze on the corpses of the men who have rebelled against me. Their worm shall not die, nor their fire be quenched. They shall be a horror to all flesh. and such a terrible ending to this that we don't even let it rest there. We repeat the second to last line again, and new moon after new moon and Shabbat after Shabbat, all flesh shall come to worship me, says the Lord. And so deprivation theory is invoked here to explain that you have this group of people, possibly the Levi'im, the priests that were demoted by the Kohanim, the other priests, were deprived of their social standing, were kicked out of the temple, and because of that, the non-apocalyptic forms of genres and literature did not work for them. And so the idea is that when things are going badly for me, when my life is very hard, I'm going to be susceptible to this sort of deviation from the historical, from the normative ways of thinking. I'm going to be in a mindset where I'm going to look for something a little more mediated, maybe a little more cosmological, maybe with a little calamity at the end where my enemies get schmeiced. The deprivation theory was the first approach that was made by biblical scholars to understand how this happens. It's the losers of society. It's the people who've lost their standing and who are desperate, who are the apocalypse. And I think that this is this does sort of like play into like sort of, I'll speak for myself, sort of my social. I have some social. I look down on fundamentalist Christians. I just do. It's not, I'm not proud of that. And I'm saying that not because I think that's the correct thing to do, but I think that's not uncommon. And I kind of think, well, of course they believe these crazy things because they're losers. I mean, they don't have the things that we have, and therefore they have to do these nutso things. And so I think that that's kind of a natural way to look at that. And that was the first academic pass at doing this. There are, of course, some famous problems with deprivation theory. Namely that in the contemporary society, the people who are setting up looking for UFOs to come and rescue them, who believe that extraterrestrials are going to come and it's all being hidden by the government, those aren't exclusively from the lower or deprived social classes. It seems to go throughout the whole register of social standing. Also, prophecy has been famously shown to be resistant to failure. There's a whole book about that, when prophecy fails. And the fact is that if you are invested behaviorally in something, you're resistant to evidence that ideas that you have are false or wrong, and you tend to hang on to them. And this is the idea that we tend to conduct our way, the term is cognitive dissonance, that we tend to remove dissonance between our actions and our beliefs. And if we're acting in a way, our beliefs are going to follow, even if there is abundant evidence that challenges them. And finally, many of the apocalyptic writings in the Bible can be attached reliably to elite social classes. Deprivation theory doesn't die because of those findings, because we have relative deprivation theory, which basically says you don't have to be in the deprived class to do it. You just have to be deprived relative to someone else. It's like when you're talking about crime, people try to explain crime in terms of the fact that, well, the people who commit crime, they're deprived. So they turn to crime. And you point out, well, that's not universally true. And anyway, it's a pretty wealthy society. Everyone here has a lot of things to be grateful for. And no. Okay, so they're not deprived. They're relatively deprived. They see other people have more stuff than they do, and that makes them anxious and that makes them upset. And I think that can be powerful on one hand. The problem, of course, is that it explains too much because we're all kind of relatively deprived. It's hard to find anyone who's lacking relative deprivation. But so this is the fallback. When the problems with deprivation theory emerge, we go to relative deprivation theory. Lately, in the past 20 years, there's been kind of a watershed in how we look at this, and we've been thinking that maybe we've been looking at it wrong, because there's a lot of evidence that some of the more brutal apocalypses in the Hebrew Bible are written with people that we can identify readily with the elites, with the Kohanim, particularly in the priestly circles. I'm not going to read through this entire thing, but the very famous apocalypse in Ezekiel, Mog and Magog, which you hear about through the Christian literature. It's one of the signs that the world's going to end. So people will pick out countries. Maybe Russia is Gog, and I don't know, Iraq is Magog, something like that. But it's based on this prophecy in Ezekiel, which describes these two strange armies coming out of the east to have this massive battle in the land of Israel, the entire purpose of which is to accumulate a lot of corpses. And it's by all of these people being killed that the honor and purity of the land of Israel is going to be restored, that the sins of the Jewish people have wrecked the land of Israel. But and usually the priests understand it figuratively. When Leviticus says you'll be vomited out of the land, it doesn't mean we'll be literally vomited out of it. But Ezekiel starts to take it literally. The land needs to be purified from our sins. So there's this huge battle, hundreds of thousands of corpses around the land of Israel, so many corpses that the house of Israel will spend 7 months doing nothing but burying them. And that's all we're going to do for 7 months, is walk around the land and finding these corpses and putting them into the ground. Finally, and we're going to tell all of the birds and all the wild beasts to come and gather around for the sacrificial feast I'm preparing for you, a great sacrificial feast upon the mountains of Israel, that you are going to come and eat flesh and drink blood. She'll eat the flesh of the warriors and drink the blood of the princes of the earth, rams, lambs, he-goats, bulls, all of them. And these animals are going to eat fat to satiety and drink blood, because there are going to be so many corpses, so much blood. It's been such a disaster. Thus will I manifest my glory among the nations. When we have this terrible battle with hundreds and thousands of corpses, the nations will see the judgment that I executed and the power that I wielded against them. And from that time on, the house of Israel will know that I am the Lord, their God. This is a very bloody and very extensively, I've just given you the highlights of this. And if you want to do the whole thing, it's Ezekiel 39. But the point of this is this seems to have almost certainly come from the priestly school. This is almost certainly a priestly document. It does not come from any sort of outcast. This seems to be a very mainstream elite apocalypse. And so the consideration now is that the apocalypse doesn't necessarily come from deprived or relatively deprived castes, but it's perhaps an elite phenomenon, and it's perhaps related more to the wisdom traditions than to the prophetic traditions. And so we are kind of in the process in the scholarly community of reconsidering where these things come from, and that has implications for what we are looking at today. And as we see apocalyptic rhetoric coming at us from really all directions, I think. I just so I am cruising towards the end here. Don't panic. I lost my clock, but I'm cruising towards the end. What are the things that I look around at that make me think, boy, I am walking around in the apocalyptic genre? And it isn't necessarily, again, to me, the fact that everybody thinks that everything is going to end. Everybody does think that it's going to end, I think. But then there are no apocalypses out there about how things are going to be fantastic in just a few years. But but those aren't the things but I think that pessimism is universal and not necessarily apocalyptic. The things that wake me up and make me think hard about these things and inspire many of the sermons that I give. One, we should be aware that there is a contemporary debate on the nature of the successor ideology. The successor ideology is just what we call what people think now, as opposed to what they used to think when people went to church. What is the content of the program of the United States in terms of its dialogue? Now that in my lifetime, mainline Protestantism has gone from being close to 60% of the having 60% of the allegiance of American citizens down to close to zero. It just disappeared. And is the successor ideology, is it prophetic, which is hinted at when we call it woke, that they're awake, that they're giving moral instructions that are prophetic, that everybody could understand, and they're trying to fix society? Or is it apocalyptic? And should we call them elect instead of woke? This is kind of a debate going around the academic water cooler in many different places. It's just a matter of how you evaluate the language that is being used. Is the language that being used in the successor ideology, is it open? Is it clear? Is it trying to is it addressing everyone, or is it closed? Is it mediated? And I think that it's more of a mediated sort of narrative, and so I tend to prefer the title elect rather than woke in describing sort of the content of what people are living today. Mediation is an inescapable aspect of our conversation today. And when I was thinking about a way to talk about this today, the thing that kept coming back to my mind until about 10 years ago, and my dad was a moderately unsuccessful writer. He wrote a book about volcanoes, tried to cash in on the Mount St. Helens craze. He wrote a column for a newspaper. So I've always loved newspapers. Until about 10 years ago, it was not considered appropriate for a reporter in a story to describe a position as false. That if there was a controversy, you would present both sides, say, well, X said something, Y said that's not true. You give any information that you have to make the reader make the decision, but you don't referee between those for the reader. And that was sort of the dominant idea that journalism worked until about 10 years ago. And we see it's very different today, that the word false is attached to a lot of things. And there's no right way or wrong way to go about these things. But the fact that it is so important for us to have that adjective true or false in front of something, that it's so important to mediate, to kind of control the dialogue, and fact and context checking is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It might have been a Freudian slip. I wrote fake and context checking, but fact and context checking is ubiquitous, and I think that that's an aspect of a more apocalyptic form of dialogue. And finally, mental prepositions are given incredible moral weight in our world. And that's one of the reasons that we're so careful about what we say, and maybe not as careful about the things that we do as we ought to be, because having a wrong opinion, having an opinion that isn't part of the gnosis, that isn't part of the what's prescribed, that does sort of move you along the saved and damned continuum, from the saved into the damned. And I think that that has to do with that has to do with moral panics and purity, as well as the apocalyptics, but those things are related. And so those are things that I look at in society when I think that the mode of apocalypticism is on the rise. Those are the things that I look at. And in addition to the fact that the destination that everyone seems to agree upon is something very negative and very cataclysmic and somewhat cosmological and not necessarily historical, it makes me think that the apocalyptic is on the march. What do I do about it? And those of you who have taken on the arduous task of listening to me give sermons every week, there's nothing here that you haven't heard a zillion times. I do want to emphasize something that our recent scholar in residence brought up several times, because it's very important. We have to understand the difficulty of changing opinions that have been reinforced through actions. That when people take on a political cause and it becomes something that they do, they're going to be very resistant to arguments that contradict those beliefs. Even if those arguments are compelling, cognitive dissonance is going to work against us in trying to argue with them. And so this isn't something that we're going to be able to sit them down at the kitchen table and say, wait a minute, I'm going to show you these charts. I'm going to show you this data. I'm going to prove to you that this doesn't exist. That's really very difficult. And if you want to, I mean, the fact is, if you want people to think a certain way, the best thing you can do is get them to do something for you. If I can get you to ring doorbells, I can, I can have you, I can put a lot of my thoughts in your head if I can get you to make even a small change in the actions that you make. It's the teaching of cognitive dissonance that's the direction that change really goes in. I do speak a lot about the priestly idea of realized eschatology. This is the teaching that after most of the days of creation, God, Vayar Elohim, and God looks at it and he beholds that it's tov. He sees that it's good. There is at the heart of Judaism, I believe, a teaching that creation does not conspire against us, that reality is real. This was a Rosh Hashanah sermon this year. And this differentiates us both from Christianity, which is more consumed with the apocalyptic than we are, but it also separates us from the larger societal conversations, which I think are immersed in the apocalyptic, that it grounds us in a sense that the world is good, there's a reality, and we run towards that reality. Because as painful as life is, there are parts of life that are painful and unavoidable. There's sickness, there's death, there's betrayal, there's everything. That it's only by facing those things, looking into the whirlwind, acknowledging the reality of them, and getting on with things, that we are able to really see both also the blessings, the wonder and the beauty of the world. And so I'm a big pitch man for realized eschatology when I teach. I'm also really, and this is probably the most things people find most tedious about what I do, but I believe they're so important, so I don't dare stop them. I encourage the academic study of Judaism and the study of science as a part of the religious Jewish life. We connect ourselves to the prophetic through the study of history. We ground ourselves in the fact that we're a society and we have responsibilities and there are things that we can do. Some societies have done better things, some societies have done worse things, but it's by knowing as much history as possible, we have the correct perspective. We have the correct placement of ourselves. And also science gives us the perspective that we need as well to be truly religious. Then I'm a strong acolyte in taking back the word science, which is now written with a capital S, because it is itself a force of mediation. It is a force of authority. It is something that is trying to construct a certain reality and put people into different camps. And I want to promote the small S science. It's just about trying to expose yourself to all the nonsense that you can. In this big pile of nonsense, trying to find the things that work and to do your best to try to understand the world, even though our ability to do so is so limited, probably less limited than we would like. More limited than we would like, and more limited than the person who has the apocalyptic in his hand, who has the secret teaching in his hand. He's going to tempt us to believe we can know more than we can know. And science with the small s reminds us how little that we can know. And I think that that's a very stabilizing, teaching. And I went over a few minutes. It's 8:54, but that's not bad for me. So I've been talking for 50 minutes now. I'm eager to hear your questions, your corrections, and whatever you have. Nat, you look concerned. And you're muted.
Well, and you touched on it a little while ago, but I just wanted to return to it. Why do you think it is that these tales, this whole line of thinking is attractive to so many people?
I think my mind's kind of set up. I mean, I think my instinct is to say because it addresses deprivations that we have. I mean, my psychological model of it is also kind of the academic theory that we hurt quite a bit as people, and it's soothing sometimes to have a secret teaching that can't be falsified. That I think that's a sense of security, and I think that's a very human and natural thing to want to have.
And following up on that, then it would seem then that there might be similar sorts of things in other cultures, completely different from Judaism and Christianity. Just curious, are you or others familiar with other similar sorts of phenomenon in non-Western cultures?
I think there's an anthropologist here who can. Riva, set us straight. You're muted.
There are. They're sometimes called millennial cults, or millennial cults that assume that something great is going to happen and everything will be transformed. They're prevalent in Melanesia. Some Melanesian societies have envisioned airplanes landing and bringing cargo, bringing them Western goods. And that will be an end to the world they live in now and change the world. So yes, the answer is yes. But I want to add something else. I don't think that individual psychological, that an explanation on the basis of individual psychologies can explain big social movements. So I just wanted to say that.
It's a very sobering thing for an intellectual historian to have to face.
There's social explanations for social movements.
Thank you, Riva.
You're welcome. I hope I was helpful to somebody.
I don't think you need to worry. Other
Rabbi, the more extreme versions of climate change, which sometimes say, well, the earth will become uninhabitable. Would you call those apocalyptic visions?
They can have the they can have the attributes of like my little scheme here. I mean, they could have otherworldly or non-historical or non-scientific aspects to them that would that would put them in that camp. There's also a lot of mediation involved with that. I don't feel that that's I don't feel that that's helpful or really necessary. I mean, it's the if you can, I mean, just my cards on the table, I find the apocalyptic thing a little pathological, and my instinct is if you can explain something in a non-pathological way and a pathological way, just explain it in the non-pathological way. And take note that there are ways that it's done that aren't healthy, and you can express those concerns in a way that's scientific, that's prophetic, that connects us to history and to science and to each other, and then it's not apocalyptic. It's apocalyptic when you start to have groups take themselves out of the larger society, or individuals take them out of society. They're isolating themselves from correction and engagement, and the and they develop a perspective that's not historical or scientific, and it becomes an obsession with the catastrophe for some reason. That's not good. But I mean, the fact that you can do that, you don't have to do that, makes me uncomfortable describing climate change in general as an apocalyptic movement.
It seems that the whole discussion about climate change is now a debate between the apocalyptic and the scientific.
I'll take your word for that. I don't listen to as much of. I have a fairly selective realm of things that I pay close attention to, and the rhetoric of climate change is something that I don't pay that much attention to for whatever reason. I have my opinions that it's an important issue, and I'm not necessarily worried about studying how it plays out. But I take your word for it. The conversations that we have today are impoverished because we put them in the voices that take us apart from each other. And I think the apocalyptic can bond some communities, but an essential part of it is that there's a difference between, for every apocalypse, there's an inside and an outside. For every apocalypse, there's an inside and an outside. And I think that the more constructive ways of communications are ones that don't try to have that separation, that has everyone on the same open channel.
The fact that predictions of climate change include monumental disaster is not, it seems to me, not apocalyptic. I'm not used to speaking in the Greek, but it's rather a prediction based on evidence. Global warming, the melting of the polar glaciers, and all of that. We're familiar with the evidence, and the evidence for me is so powerful and overwhelming that I do fear global disaster, and we're getting the beginnings of it. But that's not apocalyptic, if I understand the idea clearly enough. It's a rational fear based on evidence. It's an interesting question, I think.
No, I agree with you absolutely, and my contribution for what it's worth would be that we're led astray by the use of the language that makes apocalypse just another word for disaster. And don't think of climate things. Think of the word nuclear apocalypse. I mean, it's not like an inside or a socially mediated theory against history to claim that the exchange of nuclear weapons between countries is going to be an unbelievable catastrophe. And we call that an apocalypse because we just use the word apocalypse to describe catastrophes. But I think in climate change, we have when we describe it as an apocalypse, we give kind of we give an opening to a voice that would want to put the dialogue in terms that are more suspicious than it needs to be.
I think this lecture was extremely informative and beautifully done, and I want to thank you for offering it. Thank you.
I want to thank you for your compliment, and thank you for your contribution. And I want to thank everyone. It's every time I turn on the Zoom for a class, there's this moment of fear. What if no one comes on? What if it's just me and the monitor? And I can't tell you what it means to me to have 20 people join me for this. Thank you so much.
Oh, good. This is really quite good.
Great.
So Bill, I have I've been trying to formulate this into a question, and I can't because I really need to ruminate a bit on this revelatory way of thinking about apocalyptic. But it just makes me think about, the second century movement of Gnosticism and how that sort of fits in. And I know that that's not squarely in the wheelhouse of this discussion. And so that's why I'm having trouble formulating that question. So maybe I'll have to come back to it, and I'll just throw that out there of, that the sense of the inability to reconcile that. And so those voices get silenced. They do not get incorporated into what becomes the mainstream narrative, which is sort of inherently apocalyptic anyway. But anyway, so I can't quite settle on a question, but I just wanted to throw that out there for thinking.
Gnosticism is such a big time. I struggle too how to incorporate it. I used it a couple of times in the lecture, and it's a word that I almost hate to use because it's so multivalent, and I think it's difficult to try to. As I have the same struggle, Melissa. I have the same struggle.
Well, then I feel really good about my struggle if you're struggling as well. Feel very validated.
And I love that you're the only one who raises their hand. That must be, is it the sociology of somebody who teaches at the University of Maine?
Yeah, I must be trying to, yeah.
I want to say hi to my mom-in-law, Julie Stern, who's on from the state of Florida, whose election is over. And say hi to my mom, Lynn Hansing. It's great to see you.
I'd like to respond to what Riva said about talking about psychology of an individual to explain these things. There's certainly a tendency to say, well, our political problems now are a result of Trump's weird psychology, but there are much bigger things at work here. You have to credit him. He's the first person to recognize the power of the internet in the way that Roosevelt recognized the power of radio and Kennedy recognized the power of television. And you have to credit Trump for being the first politician for recognizing the power of the internet. It's not dependent, what's going on is not just the result of his strange upbringing and psychology.
No, this is the Riva, of course, has the first right to respond, and so I'll yield to her.
Well, what I meant when I said that I thought it mistaken to interpret social movements by individual psychology, I didn't mean a particular individual like Trump. I meant saying people think or people feel, and that's why we have a social movement. And when I said that social movements need social explanations, we have to look, I meant that we should be looking at the nature of the society, what's going on in the society that makes people behave as they do. That is, the social is first, and people's ideas and reactions come afterwards. So if we have a whole messianic movement, we have to look at the nature of the society that is producing this, not the psychology of the individual people.
If I could just check to see that I'm getting it. So the point is sociology does not equal the sum of all the psychologies.
Right. How simply you put it.
Well, I wish everyone a good night.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Night.